Recently I did a video about Debian including non-free firmware in their installer, and in the comments section, I had a lot of people mentioning the Free Software Foundation, saying the FSF is not going to be happy about this change, because Debian, is well known as a free Linux distribution, only using free software. But I don't know how many of you know this, but the FSF doesn't endorse Debian, and to the best of my knowledge, has never done so. So over on the GNU website, they maintain a list of the Free Software Foundation recommended and endorsed Linux distributions. And on that list, we have things like Dragora, Dynabolic, Geeks, Hyperbola, Parabola, PureOS, Trisqueal, Utoto, and that's it for the desktop distributions. There are a couple of embedded systems like LibreCMC and ProteinOS, but Debian has never been on this list. Now, over the years, there have been some efforts from the Debian maintainers to get Debian onto this list, but they've never successfully done so, even though they have what most people define as a 100% free Linux distribution, and we're going to go over why. The first reason is in the Debian social contract. This defines how the Debian project as a collective is going to interact with the free software community. What they are going to do, what they aren't going to do, how they're going to handle things like licensing and distribution and source code, and all of this fun stuff. Now, most of this, the FSF is in complete agreement with, and there's nothing wrong with it whatsoever, or it just has absolutely nothing to do with the FSF. And you would think if they followed this first point completely, they would be in line with the FSF. Debian will remain 100% free. We provide the guidelines we use to determine if a work is free in the document entitled the Debian Free Software Guidelines. We promise that the Debian system and all its components will be free according to these guidelines. We will support people who create or use both free and non-free works on Debian. We will never make the system require the use of a non-free component. The FSF wouldn't be happy about a user using or making non-free software, but they can't exactly hold Debian accountable for what every single one of their users are going to be doing. What they can hold them accountable for is what they actively endorse. Works that do not meet our free software standards. We acknowledge that some of our users require the use of works that do not conform to the Debian Free Software Guidelines. We have created contrib and non-free areas in our archive for these works, basically a separate repo that will include this non-free code. The packages in these areas are not a part of the Debian system, although they have been configured for use with Debian. To the FSF, contrib and non-free are absolutely a part of the Debian system. They're not part of the vanilla installation of Debian, so if you use the free installer, you will get a completely free installation and those repos won't be enabled. But they are part of the Debian system because they're owned and maintained by the Debian project. So a user can go and add one of these officially endorsed repos in and then start installing non-free software. Also, the use of these repos is documented by the Debian project. Basically, making the installation of non-free software convenient is effectively endorsing non-free software from their perspective. Is that a dumb position to hold? Well, you can make the argument either way. What you can't argue against is for a lot of Debian's early life, they weren't actually following the Debian social contract. I don't mean with the Debian user space, I mean with its kernel. So remember point 1, Debian will remain 100% free. Let's even go back to the original version of the social contract. We promise to keep the Debian GNU Linux distribution entirely free software. As there are many definitions of free software, we include the guidelines we use to determine if software is free below. We'll support our users who develop and run non-free software on Debian, but will never make the system depend on an item of non-free software. And then that changed what we see in the modern version with 1.1, but still overall has basically the same meaning. You probably know where I'm going with this. The non-free binary blobs shipped in the mainline Linux kernel. If you didn't know, there are actually sections of the Linux kernel that are proprietary. This is shipped on Arch Linux, Ubuntu, and most other Linux distributions out there. But for obvious reasons, this kernel is not endorsed by the FSF. I'm not sure exactly when the first binary blob made its way into the Linux kernel, but from that point, all the way up to 2011 with the release of Debian 6.0 Squeeze, some of these binary blobs made their way onto Debian systems. The Debian project has been working in removing non-free firmware from the Linux kernel shipped with Debian for the past 2 release cycles. At the time of the releases of Debian 4.0 Etch and 5.0 Lenny, however, it was not yet possible to ship Linux kernel stripped of all the non-free firmware bits. Back then, we had to acknowledge that freedom issues concerning Linux firmware were not completely sorted out. From the release of 6.0 onwards, all of the non-free firmware was stripped out of the kernel, and if you need to use that non-free firmware, then you need to go and use the non-free installer, or download the firmware and load it inside of the free installer. Now, all of this by itself is enough to not be endorsed by the FSF. But as I mentioned, they've made moves over the years to try and make this happen. And any of the old school Debian users might know what I'm about to mention. There was a period of time where Debian didn't ship any Mozilla branded software, starting around 2005-2006 with software like SeaMonkey, Thunderbird, Sunbird, and of course, Firefox. All of these projects to a regular person, a regular Linux user, are without a doubt free software. They are licensed under a free software license, and you can do what you want with them in that free software manner. But the FSF is not run by regular people. There are extra requirements on top of things to make sure they are actually free software. One of the issues that this Mozilla software has is, firstly, in things like Firefox, for example, it invites people to install non-free software in the form of non-free plugins. But that doesn't affect every piece of their software. What does is the name and the logo. These are trademarks of Mozilla, which is something that the FSF already isn't really that happy with. They don't really like the idea of trademarking things. But the issue here is that if you go and modify the browser, you modify any of these pieces of software, you are not allowed to distribute it under the same name. And Debian will actually go and modify it to address vulnerabilities downstream. However, that doesn't mean you can't go and fork it. It is free software, you can go and do so. So the Gigabrain Debian maintainers had a great idea. What if we just didn't use the name? So what they did is they made forks of the projects that were identical to the Mozilla ones, except for the name and the logo. So we had Ice Ape for SeaMonkey, we had Ice Dove for Thunderbird, which is a terrible name. We had Ice Owl for Sunbird, and Ice Weasel for Firefox. And the FSF is perfectly happy about this software. But during that period, they were also shipping the non-free kernel, so nothing actually changed. But if you're using modern Debian, you might notice a distinct lack of Ice Doves and Ice Weasels. Well, that's because everything changed back in 2016, renaming Ice Weasel to Firefox. And the only part that's really important here is this. About the Debian-specific patches, Mozilla recognizes that patches applied to Iceweasel/Firefox don't impact the quality of the product. Patches which should be reported upstream to improve the product always have been forwarded upstream by the Debian packages, and Mozilla agrees about specific patches to facilitate the support of Iceweasel on architectures supported by Debian or Debian-specific patches. More generally, Mozilla trusts the Debian packages to use their best judgment to achieve the same quality as the official Firefox binaries. In case of derivatives of Debian, Firefox branding can be used as long as the patches applied are in the same category as above. But Ubuntu having a different packaging, this does not apply to that distribution. And then shortly after, in 2017, the same thing also happened with Thunderbird. And this is great for the regular user of Debian. Now they have Firefox and aren't confused by this weird Iceweasel thing. but it doesn't actually change anything from the FSS perspective. They still don't like the way this trademark is being handled by Mozilla. Sure, Debian now has permission to use it, but the trademark is still there. Also, it doesn't change anything regarding the plugin situation. You can still install non-free plugins. But this isn't just a vendetta against Debian. The FSF doesn't typically endorse that many distributions. We're often asked why we don't endorse a particular system, usually a popular GNU/Linux distribution. The short answer to that question is that they don't follow the free system distribution guidelines. But since it isn't always obvious how a particular distro fails to follow the guidelines, this list gives more information about the problems of certain well-known non-free system distros. Say, for example, Gentoo. Gentoo includes installation recipes for a number of non-free programs in its primary package system. So it doesn't matter that you can install a completely free Gentoo system, and you can even stop your package manager installing non-free packages. Because they are in a Gentoo endorsed repo, it's a part of Gentoo. Or something like Fedora. Fedora does have a clear policy about what can be included in the distribution, and it seems to be followed carefully. The policy requires that most software and all fonts be available under a free license, but makes an exception for certain kinds of non-free firmware. Unfortunately, the decision to allow that firmware in the policy keeps Fedora from meeting the free system distribution guidelines. And we can do this all day, whether it's Arch Linux, CentOS, whether it's Mandriva, Manjaro, Mint, NixOS, OpenSUSE, Red Hat, or a bunch of other distributions. For anything to be free as defined by the FSF, it needs to be 100% free with no cracks in the armor. There shouldn't be any convenient ways to install non-free software. There shouldn't be any documentation on how to do so. It should be a free system, and that is it. It doesn't matter how good the distribution is. It doesn't matter if it works on modern hardware. All that matters is it is completely free. Do you think this is taking free software way too far, or do you think this is the only sensible way to have a completely free system? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. So if you like this video, remember to go and like the video. If you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, go check out my Patreon, subscribe, starting Bearer Pay, linked in the description down below. I've got a podcast called Tech Over Tea. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie Robertson Plays. That's going to be it for me, and I'm out.